Hey guys, what's cracking? Godsman here, coming at you with an updated Drajeweled deck profile. That's right, so first we had the original Drajeweled, then we had Drajeweled Ignis, and now we're on to the final evolution of Drajeweled, which is Drajeweled Ignis. Yeah, this thing's quite of a doozy of a boss, and it came out of frickin' nowhere, might I add. So I wasn't necessarily prepared to do a deck profile on it right away, but... it was ruminating in the back of my mind to begin with already, but we had a sub here on a recent post of mine who suggested to do it, if for no other reason than for the completion, because I did do deck profiles on the other versions of Drajeweled, so why not do it with this one? Now, I'll put straight up that I'm not quite as excited for this version of the deck, mainly because it's become a much more simplified game plan and just overall kind of a basic beatdown deck by comparison, which is massively unfortunate because Drajeweled previously felt to be a really interesting and unique playstyle, relatively speaking. I know some people called it the dust of standard and whatnot, but I didn't ascribe to that at all. I thought it was a fairly unique deck, and it had a lot of fun interactions if you really took the time to build in some really neat toolbox options. But now it's a much more lean, mean killing machine, if you will, which maybe not good on the fun aspect, but it's definitely good on the kill your opponent and win aspect, because this thing is a god tier support card, along with a lot of the other really amazing supports that Drajeweled got. So today I'm just going to be explaining my deck profile, going over the choices, and maybe some of the differences from the previous Drajeweled deck profiles. Almost all the cards in here are new, relatively speaking, so I will be doing a lot of explaining this one. So buckle up and let's begin the ride. So let's start with probably one of the only things that hasn't changed in Drajeweled, which is going to be the ride line. So I'm not going to introduce it one at a time, but rather just show it all right here. So your ride line is quite simple. You go from Jewelias Dracokid, which is not required by the way, so you can do any starter if you want to try and fool your opponent, into Jewel Core Dragon. Just, you know, put itself out, get an extra attack, put it back in so you can maintain your grades. This one gives you soul charge advantage and it's a decent attacker. And then finally you go into your base Drajeweled. Now base Drajeweled is only going to be sticking around for one turn, because optimally you'll want to ride to your grade 4. Yeah, it's weird that it's a grade 4, but it's also really epic. Your grade 4 Drajeweled. But for turn 3, he's still a very good boss. You probably want to use the counterblast skill. That's going to be one of the new things about this, is whereas in the Drajeweled Mask version, you weren't quite as incentivized to use the Counterblast skill, because Counterblast is a lot more called for in that version of the deck. In this deck, Counterblast is way easier because your main boss doesn't CB anymore whatsoever. Yeah, I know, that's crazy. So you'll probably want to do this just to get the extra draw on the soul, and also it's just a really good boss aside from that, right? I mean, heck, when you think about it, reducing your opponent's Vanguard 1 is pretty good power numbers even without Persona Ride being in this deck anymore. So yeah, I'd say still try to use this best of your ability for the one turn that it's out. Alright, so let's talk about the real boss of the deck. So we have Drajeweled Ignis. So Drajeweled Ignis is a behemoth of a grade 4 card, and the first of the grade 4 cards in, I guess, the new generation, if you will, because after the initial few grade 4s from the set 4 era, we haven't had any more, so they came back in a really big way with Drajeweled Ignis. Now, its first skill is the only skill that isn't busted, which is that it can only be written on a card with Drajeweled in its card name. So, sorry Bruce players, you will not be writing this Drajeweled over Bruce. Sad days. Now, the second skill is where the bonkers stuff really happens. So, at the beginning of your battle phase, you choose 2 cards from your drop and put them into your soul. Then, if your soul has 4 or more cards with different grades, all of your front row units will get 15,000 power until end of turn. Now, no, this is a proxy I'm using right here. It's by a guy named Alphys5 over in the subreddit for Vanguard. So go ahead and check him out if you want some proxies. He does a lot of proxies. He's really good with them. I decided to use them here because it beats using the JP. Because, you know, a lot of my audience, and me included, are English speakers. So it'd be much more preferable to actually read the card on the screen. Now, this is a really powerful skill for getting a lot of power right away. Obviously, it's 15k, but the fact that you get to choose any 2 cards is quite nuts, because as you'll recall from Drajeweled Mask, you had to persona remove a base Drajeweled in order to get that skill and the crit. But in this case, it's free and it's automatic, and it also just intertwines so well with the other effects of this deck. And that includes the final effect of Drajeweled Ignis, which states that when this ability would be paid, put a card with Drajeweled in its card name from your soul as any one of the grades between 0 and 4. So I'll explain that in a little bit. But essentially what it is when it attacks, you Soul Blast 5 cards of different grades, so 0, 1, 2, 3, and 4. Retire all of your opponent's back row rear guards. And until end of turn, this unit gets a critical. And decrease or increase the power of all of your opponent's front row units to 0. Okay. So let me quickly explain, before we get into how nuts this effect is, let me explain how the Drajeweled cost substitution works, because there was a couple questions about that. So effectively, when you're soul blasting a Drajewel from the soul, it can be counted as any grade from 0 through 4. So 0, 1, 2, 3, and 4 are the 5 different grades that you can choose for the soul blast 5 cost. It does not substitute the entire cost though. You can't soul blast one Drajewel and say, alright, that's soul blast 5. No, you could just substitute it for one of the grades. And this does apply for multiple Drajewels. So for instance, if you have, say, an Ignis and a regular Drajewel in the soul, when you soul blast for Ignis, you can treat these as 2 other grades if you happen to need other grades in the soul. So that's really, really good for making this skill super easy to proc every turn. Now, I think it's a skill that, despite it being really simple to accumulate the grades, it's still fairly expensive to Soul Blast 5 every turn, so you're probably going to achieve it about 3 times in a game. But then again, you or your opponent should be losing by 3 turns of this into the game, so that's more or less a moot point in 99% of cases. Now, as for the effect itself, there's a lot going on here. The back row field wipe is really potent for the control matchup, obviously, but it's got more of that Drajeweled mass goodness that we loved, which was the retires. Now, these retires are arguably weaker or better depending on how you look at it, because it can't get rid of the front row whatsoever, and you don't really choose per se, you're just wiping out all of the back row. But because you're wiping out all of the back row, that does mean that you're getting the potential to get rid of 3 cards. Your opponent committed 3 cards against this thing, and B, you're actually able to field wipe even stuff that has the resist clause, which is to say like trick stars which can't be chosen by card effects. You're not choosing them, you're just wiping out their entire back row carte blanche. So you can get around those kind of resist units. That means that Vilords are also going to go bye-bye against this thing, which is quite nutty indeed. So it's a very powerful field wipe skill. And let's also bring up the fact that, again, you have the crit and the 2 in the soul, which is just a complete power creep of Drajeweled Mass for the most part. But now you also have this really, really minor difference that makes a major impact. Reducing the power of your opponent's units in the front row. So, I mean, the rear guards are one thing, but it's mainly the Vanguard, of course. Reducing them to 0 instead of 1 makes so much difference on your numbers. It is crazy. Now, I'm going to go more into a couple of the numbers later with a couple of the cards, but let's just put into perspective here that because they're at 0, that means that when you reach certain thresholds of, like in increments of 5k, let's say like 20 or 25, your opponent's going to have to be giving out an extra 5k shield more than they normally would have in order to guard them. And those extra 5k shields are really easy to ask your opponent in this deck because of the way the numbers work in this deck now. Especially since you're giving 15, a flat 15, which, you know, that flat 15 on its own, even if you were attacking with a 0 attack unit into a flat 15, they would still have to guard for 20 because they're at a brand spanking 0. That's how devastating this freaking ability is. So yeah, it's an incredible boss unit. You're most likely going to be able to kill with it on the first or second turn that you do it. If they do survive the first turn, then they essentially have to try and GG you, or you're going to just kill them on the next turn of this. And you will be able to afford this for 2 turns very easily, especially since you can bring back 2 Drajewels from the drop zone back into the soul to count as any 2 grades that you may need. That's pretty damn strong. The only other thing to say about it is, remember, it's got the triple drive and it's a grade 4. So there's a couple of good things about that. There's a couple of good bad things about that. That means it's a turn 4 strategy inherently, and it also means that you don't have Elementaria. So that's the bad stuff. The good stuff though is that because you have a triple drive, you're going to be able to have the extra stability that comes with triple drive, and you can also use a couple of grade 4 support cards that we've seen here and there, and we're actually going to see one right coming up. And yeah, it's a bit of a toss-up on whether or not it being a grade 4 is a good thing or a bad thing. I think a lot of people would argue that it kind of holds it back in the sense of pacing, and you kind of need to go fast and standard these days. It's very unfortunate, but that's just how it is. But especially if you go first, it's not an issue, and you could basically blow out your opponent with just this massively powerful grade 4. Okay, so as promised, we're going to go over a card that distinctly helps with grade 4s, and that would be Noctalgeo. I'm not really good at saying his name, but then again, pronouncing cards in decks like these has just always been a big feat to begin with. So this is kind of a convoluted card on paper, but it's actually really simple, and it's also just kind of boring in a way, but let's go over it. So when this card is placed on rear or put on the Guardian Circle, you choose up to one grade 4 card in your hand and reveal it, or if you have a grade 4 card, you get to activate one of the effects below depending on the circle in which it was placed. On the rear guard circle, you can counterblast one to draw a card and choose 2 cards from your drop and put them in your soul. But if it's the Guardian Circle, it gets 15k shield until the end of that battle. And it has a secondary skill, which is that when it's discarded from hand while riding a grade 3 from the right deck, or by paying the cost of stride, you get to immediately draw a card. So yeah, advantage. That's all this card is, and that's what a lot of this deck is, in fact. So let me just explain straight up that this is a very easy skill to pop off. So if you're trying to get, say, the rear guard effect, you're going to be able to do that in most cases as long as you have a grade 4 in the hand. If you have it on the field, then it doesn't matter. And a lot of your cards will specify to have either a grade 4 in the hand or just have a grade 4 Vanguard. So it is imperative that you have Drajeweled Ignis as early as possible to try and proc off these kind of skills. But aside from that, let's also bear in mind that because you can pitch it for the cost of going into grade 3, you may want to debate how you want your advantage. This is going to cost a counterblast in order to draw and put 2 cards from the drop into the soul. So it's a little bit more costly, but you get 2 soul for it. But if you don't need soul, then you probably want to opt just to try to pitch it right away. I mean, it's a decent rear, but as a rear guard, it's not optimal for the numbers that we're going for necessarily. Ironically, your grade 2s have much better numbers for what our columns are going to be going for in this deck. So you don't really need it to be a rear guard per se. You can always keep it as a hand in the shield if you're trying to be a little bit more grindy and tank what your opponent has. If you're pretty aware of what kind of numbers they're going to put on you, then it might be worth it. But my personal recommendation here would be to try and keep this in the hand for either pitch fodder or for shield. That would be my personal recommendation. Calling on the field is pretty solid per se, but I wouldn't do it unless you're starting to go into more of an extended game state. But, you know, it's always up to one preference. Needless to say, it's a very versatile card, and we won 3 of it because there's a lot of situations with its life. So the last grade 3 is just the Forbidoll Surrogate. So Forbidoll Surrogate, I mean, there's not really a lot to question about this here, right? You've got Drajeweled Ignis to add from deck to hand, and the importance of this thing in the hand cannot be understated. We already found the first culprit of that, which is this guy right here, which, by the way, you can also call off of Forbidoll Surrogate. Now, these are the only 2 copies that you can proc off of Forbidoll, which is a little bit unfortunate, but keep in mind that Forbidoll doesn't just search the deck, it also searches the drop zone, and that's really useful. You can get these back after you pitch them with stride fodder. I say stride fodder, rather pitch them to ride fodder, but it can be used as stride fodder if you're a Chrono Dragoon. You can also get back your Ignises from the drop if you happen to recycle them, but that's not really that useful per se, because usually you'll probably have them as a card on the field already if you have them in the drop, because you most likely have soul flashed Ignises. But let's say in rare scenarios where you've had to get rid of Ignis, or maybe you healed out an Ignis from the damage zone in the early game, this would be a way of getting it from the drop zone back to the hand. But of course, that doesn't really beat getting it from the deck anyway. I'm just telling you a lot of your options here. It's a very versatile card, and despite the low number of targets per se, it's still going to be live 99% of the time. So it's a really useful card. Okay, so next up on our list, we've got the grade 2s. Now, the grade 2s are really busting in this deck, and what better contender than the man, the myth, the legend, who has always remained in this deck at max copies in any version I've done, Rockargour. So Rockargour is the mainstay grade 2 for Drajeweled. We already know its skills well. I don't really need to discuss its skills very much. So let me just tell you why he still have 4 copies of the deck, and it's quite simple. He is a multi-attacker with massive numbers, and so he fulfills the 2 major things that your deck attempts to do, which is beat down hard and also multi-attack. So let's just explain here that 20k on a 0 is minimum of a 25k shield. That's just swinging with Rockargour, right? That's just swinging with Rockargour, and going on the second swing, it's like that. Now, if you have the 15 from Drajeweled Ignis, then that's 35 minimum, which means it's a 40k shield minimum to guard its second swing. That's not including triggers, that's not including boosts, not including other stuff. So consider how devastating that is, right? Just this one card is already able to demand so much shield as long as you've got Ignis on the field. It is so worth the CB as well, because you don't have a lot of cards that's asking CB of you. And this is a priority CB if you can manage it, just because of how big it swings. Your opponent doesn't want to be staring down at Ignis double Rockargour. That is for freaking sure. There's only one other card in this deck that can theoretically attain greater values in power than it. And even then, that card, depending on what you do with it, it won't only be on the field for 1 turn. So we'll get into her in a second, but yeah, this is just your principal attacker, and it'll always remain that way. So next up, we've got another one of the new cards, and this is Zagan. So Zagan is a pretty nutty card. He's got a really convoluted first skill, which is that when he's placed on rear during your main phase, you can soul charge 1. Then you can either reveal a grade 4, or if you have a grade 4, you can get the other part of this skill, which is that you choose 1 card with a different card name from this unit and grade less than or equal to your Vanguard from your soul and call it to rear. At the end of that turn, put that unit into the soul. So yeah, it is a temporary +1, and it also gets you a soul. That's pretty good. But it also has the other skill, and it's ironically kind of the skill I like more, which is that it's a continuous with the rear. If you have Vanguard with Drajeweled in its card name, this unit gets boost. So let me just explain the first effect a little bit, but more of this discussion is going to ironically go to a really small boost effect. So when you're trying to call things out from the soul, obviously things that you soul charge that would be useful can go out there, and most of your cards don't really specify a zone in which that they're placed. For instance, this card right here, you can call him from the soul lickety split and still get the CB skill on place the rear guard. That much is pretty easy, and it's for the same condition that this thing used. So if you could fulfill this condition, then you can fulfill that condition. So it's very synergistic. There's also other cards we'll go into later. Ooh, I shaked my camera as is tradition. There's other cards we'll go into later that are also going to be an on-place skill, such as this one, just as a little preview. This is an on-place, but doesn't specify where, so you can do it from the soul just as easily. And that's not to mention cards such as the next one, hint hint, which will put itself away at the end of the turn, and it's a battle skill, so it doesn't matter where it came from. So everything in your deck is perfectly fine with being called from the soul. And that's not to mention that there's also a pretty good ride line when it comes to having on-field units. Let's keep in mind, Jewel Core Dragon is still meant to be an attacker unit, so tutoring it back out from the soul is really neat. And this card also has an effect of soul charge when it hits, so it's technically an attacker of some sort, so you could make a column of this. Which, I mean, the effect seems lackluster, but it is going to segue into the other really important note about this deck, which is the numbers and why this boost is super important. So, when you're making a number, remember, the number you're going against now is not 1, it's 0. So you want to hit even increments of 5k as much as possible. Now, wouldn't you know it, a 10 on a 10 specifically is going to hit you to a 20k column. Then, if you have your handy dandy Drajeweled Ignis out here, that is a 35k column. Then, when you look even further beyond that, if you happen to get even more triggers, it'll incrementally increase by 10ks. So just like with Rockargour here, who's getting the 10k, aka he's kind of got his own booster, right? That's what makes him so powerful. This is another 40k column, as in it gets 40k shield out of your opponent at minimum they wish to guard it, or they're going to have the PG. just like Rockargour. So just think of the ridiculous amount of shield that would require from your opponent. That is usually going to either be 2 card guards from PGs or 2 fronts if they happen to have it, or 3 card guards from like 3 triggers. And that's multiple columns doing that, not to mention your Vanguard being really threatening with a triple drive and having the crit, right? And this is also bearing in mind that something like Rockargour is going to have power on its first swing, so it can swing over by itself so you can preserve the booster for the second swing. Do you see why having even 10Ks, 15Ks, 5Ks, these really even Steven numbers is optimal for this deck? So we want to abuse the 0 as much as possible to demand the maximum amount of shield and go for game as quick as possible. This is a very, very bursty kind of deck, which, I mean, I say is boring, but man, is it effective. People just crumble to Ignis once it's on the field. So this is going to be why it's imperative that if you can, use Zagan as a booster. He's a fantastic booster. I explained how in the Drajeweled mass profile, we had another 10k booster in the form of Twin Marvel Dragon. And in that one, 10k boosters were not that good because it didn't make very good numbers against a 1 power Vanguard. But now, oh, the story is so different. Oh, it's so good in this deck. So try to abuse that as much as possible. Okay, so now we're going to move on to the last of the grade 2s in this deck, which is the one I alluded to earlier, Servant Falcracia. Now, Servant Falcaria is one that I didn't initially think of, but having seen my boy Nabs play it, I suddenly realized, wow, this card is really good in Ignis. So let's explain what she does, because this is another newcomer. Well, relative to my profiles anyway. When this unit attacks a grade 3 or greater unit, choose up to 1 card that's Dark States from your drop, and this unit gets 5,000 power until end of battle for each of that card's grade, and put the chosen card into the soul. Really good. Second skill, auto on rear. At the end of your turn, if you have a grade 4 or greater Vanguard, which we do, you put this card into the soul and draw a card. So yeah, when I alluded before that there was 1 card that could get more power than Rockargour, I was meaning Servant Falcracia. Now, Servant Falcaria's effect here, this isn't a once per turn. You can do this twice. And you may be asking, well, how are you going to multi-attack with it? We'll get to it. But let's just trust me here. You can get 2 attacks with this thing. So, with each attack, you're not only going to be able to gain a soul, but you can gain a certain amount of power. Now, as long as what you're putting in is minimum of grade 2, you're getting the same amount of power that Rockargour is getting for that swing. Then, if you're putting in something like the grade 4s, which we do conveniently have because this is a grade 4 deck, then you're getting an extra 20k power on that swing. If you happen to have 2 grade 4s in there, then you can put them in twice, which is 2 doses of extra 20k, so 30k, 45 with the extra 15, demanding 50 shield on each of those swings. And the cherry on top is, if you are putting in things like Drajeweleds, keep in mind that Drajeweled Ignis' skill does count Drajeweleds as any grade when soul blasting it, so it just makes the whole condition even easier. It's so free and busted. I can't fathom why they made it this way, but this is the world we live in, so we're going to try and make the most out of it, right? Right. So, the second skill of Servant Falcaria is also fairly useful, because by putting into the soul and drawing a card, if you're going into a field retire matchup, which those are still around because of Gondiva and whatnot, against field retire matchups, you definitely can clear out your field with Falcarias if you happen to see the Falcarias. There's another card we'll get into in a second that also clears itself from the field. So you do have a couple of measures against field control matchups that you can bring to bear. Now, it's not going to be the smoothest thing either. They'll usually pick off a couple things from you. You want to invest because you're trying to kill quicker rather than... You're trying to kill sooner rather than later, right? So, you will play into that matchup, but this is still one way to mitigate it while also maintaining advantage by a card in the hand. So, yeah, it's a really good card. I'm saying the word "so" a lot, which may sound annoying, but it's because I'm sort of flabbergasted by how well Servant Falcaria specifically works with Drajeweled Ignis. It works better than it does in Chronojet. It works better than it does in Grade 4 Bruce. This card was kind of made for Ignis, and that's it's supremely surprising because the timing of when this card released didn't seem to really coincide with Ignis's existence at all. Now, maybe Bushy just had a plan all along, or this is just some sort of miracle intertwining of the stars. But yeah, Falcaria is one of the best support cards that this deck is ever going to have, as long as it's in the grade 4 form. Okay, so that does it for the grade 2s. Let's move on to the grade 1s. Now, in the vein of grade 1s, let's talk about the new grade 1, which is also, well, one of the 2 new grade 1s rather, and also the most busted of them. This, my friends, is a multi-attacker. Yes, Varpra has the skill that auto on rear, when you Soul Blast 4 or more cards with the same time for one of your Vanguard's abilities, aka Drajeweled skills, both of them, mind you, you put it at the soul and draw a card. Then choose up to 1 card from your hand, that's grade 4, or if you have a grade 4 Vanguard, you get the rest of the skill, which is that you choose one of your rear guards, and if that rear guard did not stand by a card's ability this turn, you stand it. Well, look at that. This is a replacement for Imposa, which, yes, if you notice, we went through the entire grade 2 section and didn't put in Imposa. Now, they may seem weird to you, but I think that since this is an Imposa replacement, I actually like it better than Imposa. Keep in mind, right, Imposa will retire itself to add a grade 2 or greater from the soul back to the hand, whereas this one will put itself into the soul, so it keeps your soul fueled to draw a card. So even though the card is more random, it also gives you the potential for more shield, and you can just take the advantage anyway. But this is more convenient, because the one thing about Imposa is that even though Imposa was a free restand, and this is also effectively a free restand, right? The thing about Imposa was it's a very weak attacker. This, however, can restand your Falcarias, which are stronger attackers. It could also restand potentially a Rockargour that you couldn't pay the cost for but still had the plus 10k. That's another really good restand. You could also restand things like Noctalgeo if you want. There's just a lot of good restand targets that would just all be better swingers than a random Imposa on the field. So that's a really good betting point here. Plus, he's also a really neat booster in terms of your attack patterns, because you can boost with him on the first swing when your attackers may not be quite as strong, since the Vanguard for the opponent is still normally at 13k. So you can boost to help make good numbers against that, and then move him into Soul for the restand when your Vanguard does its swing and does its effect. So he's got a lot of really good utility for multi-attack and advantage, and just like I said, it's everything this deck does, and he's just a centerpiece of that kind of strategy. So we run him out all 4 copies. Okay, next up on the list, we've got 3 copies of Horde/Dracokid. So Horde/Dracokid is a good, she's just a straight up consistency card for you. So when he's placed on rear guard, anywhere on rear guard, so again, Zagan could get him from Soul and you meet the condition just fine. You CB1, and then you look at the top 7 cards of the deck, choose up to 1 grade 4 with Drajeweled and its card name from among them, reveal and put in your hand and shuffle your deck. But if you did not reveal a card, then you can choose a grade 4 in the hand, where we heard this before, or if you have a grade 4 Vanguard, with Drajeweled in its name, you draw a card. So, again, I mentioned it with Noctalgeo. They really love this reveal/have grade 4 condition in this deck. So please, dear Lord, have Ignis in the hand if you can. So this will help you get Ignis in the hand, by the way. That's why it's here. And CB, as you've noticed, is not really that called for, because the main practitioners to CB is going to be your Rockargours. It's going to be this guy. And if you want to throw out Noctalgeos, you can do a Noctalgeo maybe here and there. You could do the basic Drajeweled skill for a CB as well. CB is not hard in this deck anymore, which thank the Lord, because it certainly was in Mask, and that was the main thing holding that version of the deck back, but not this version of the deck. CB is essentially candy. You just pop it for whatever you see fit. So this is just a good consistency card, and even if you just pop it down and you already have a Drajeweled Ignis in the hand, then worst case scenario, you just CB for a draw. That's what it's good for. But if you have it as just a CB for a draw, then that's probably the scenario where you just CB for other more important things. But still, this is just a really good consistency card, because if you're not a god gamer, you're not going to see Drajeweled Ignis in the hand in every fight. So this is one of the best ways to make sure that you can fetch a Drajeweld from the deck to the hand. And considering that the only Drajewelds that we are playing in the main deck is the 4 copies of Ignis, this card is going to only see the Ignises. So if you hit, you're going to be hitting the right one regardless. And that's not to mention that we do have access to Forbidoll Surrogate, which is just guaranteed Drajeweled Ignis on its own, but we need to hit into that, so there's no telling if that'll ever happen. So 3 Horde / Dracokid is just a basic consistency premise. Alright, now we're going to move on to your staply defensive cards, starting off with the final grade 1 in the deck, which is PGs. Now, I'm only going to run 4 basic PGs, and that's because Elementary Sanctitude does not work in this deck. Shock and awe, yeah. So this confuses some people. Not everyone realizes this, and it always makes me really slap my... it makes me facepalm whenever I see someone play Elementaria in a grade 4 or greater deck, because Elementaria Sanctitude, for reference, has a stipulation, if you look at it here, guys, where you play this by discarding. If your Vanguard is grade 3 or less, then it does its skill. So you can't play it in a grade 4 deck, and you can't play it in Gila as well. Sorry guys, that's not for us apparently. So we have to just run the 4 basic PGs, but with the copious amount of card advantage that you're getting in this deck, Base Drajeweld gives you card advantage, Noctalgeo gives you card advantage 2 different ways, Horde / Varja, freaking everyone ever is giving you card advantage. So you don't have a problem with just doing the extra discard if need be. And yeah, that does mean you'll fall into battle doors more, but just fuel the battle door. Give the cards up. You're trying to kill them as quick as possible, so don't just die randomly because you were trying to be a cheapskate in your defenses. Alright. Next up, we'll go into triggers. So my trigger lineup is fairly straightforward. We've got a total of 8 criticals, followed by 3 effect fronts, and 4 normal heals, and then the OT being Volnute. So the only 2 full thing that I would explain here is the presence of Volnute over the Dark States over trigger, and also why I'm not running any effect criticals. Now the effect criticals is a really easy one to explain, because simply put, 5k is better than 4k by a large degree in this deck. I've said it again and again. The 5k bases, as well as intervals of 5k, are crucial for abusing the 0k base that your opponent's Vanguard is going to be at. So, even in the loose scenario, which you would call down a critical trigger to try and make numbers, it's not usually going to make very good numbers. 5Ks are what breaks the thresholds more often than not versus the 4Ks. And even though some people would argue, oh, but what about the 2K and put it in the Soul? You don't need to put it in the Soul because you have a bajillion ways to put things into Soul already. And you don't need the 2K because in almost every scenario, that 2k is not going to be important. The only instance in which that 2k would actually do anything is if you have a grade 3 like Noctalgeo out there to make it into a 15k, which albeit is a decent means of making that 2k optimal, but it's a very niche circumstance compared to just slapping down the 5k and making it a decent booster for the number of lines that you've got going on here. So this is why we're going to be running 8 copies of just the basic critical triggers. Also a spiritual wad, so congrats on that. The other explanation, of course, is going to be my over trigger. I'm not going to explain normal heals because it's just, if any of you guys who've been watching my deck profiles for a while, you already know I like normal heals. That's just the way I do it. I don't want to chance my higher shield values on certain conditions when any opponent under the sun may be my opponent. They could be good meta calls, but again, I'm not going for basic meta calls here. I'm just going for what's going to be most reliable in most scenarios, which is the basic heal. So Volnute is optimal for your attack patterns. Because of having the restanders be on attack rather than at the end of the battle, you're going to always have front row rear guards present that are standing. Even if you don't have any restanders, this then just means that you're going for a 3 attack turn and begin with Drajeweled Ignis, because Drajeweled Ignis' attack is what prompts the 0 power down of your opponent's front row. So there is never going to be a scenario, unless you're simply swinging the Vanguard and nothing else, where Volnute is a dead card. That's why I'm going to run over the Dark States over trigger. Not to mention the Dark States over trigger is very redundant in a deck whose main Vanguard already gains a critical and has insane power numbers. So the Darkshade's Overtrigger is such a win war card by comparison, whereas this will actually be really good for closing out games if you're trying to break through your opponent's PGs in hand. So yeah, it's kind of a no-brainer. You just run Vol Noob 10 times out of 10. Alright, and that's going to be the deck. So, what do you guys think about the new Drajeweled Ignis reveal here? What do you guys think about this deck? I'd love to know down in the comment section below. Personally, even though it's very powerful, maybe not as meta-defining as some people would have thought when it was first revealed. It's still a very powerful deck. It doesn't have very many flaws, mainly just you have to get to the grade 4 and then you start killing, so it doesn't have a lot of pressure on turn 3. That's its one crippling flaw. But aside from that, it's all gravy in this deck. It's very strong, but it's just a really basic version of the deck now. With the mask version had the complication of trying to make the mask work and doing all the different pieces of Kemda and getting the Dragon Tree marker for more power lines. And then the basic version, well, the basic version had some really interesting cards like, what was his name? Drajeweled, which had the element of putting cards in the soul and then you can get retires. Like, you had a lot of really interesting pieces in the other deck, but if you've noticed, and I've said it before several times, everything in the deck here is either a beater or it's a consistency card. That's all you've got. You don't really have any utility in this deck outside of the ones that are inherently a part of the consistency bit. Perhaps your best source of utility in this deck comes by way of your Zagan, which can tutor anything back from the soul, but that's about it. Everything else is just very basic draw cards, put card into soul, so on and so forth, get number. So it's not my favorite version. I'm not gonna lie. I think Drajewel doesn't end off on a high note in terms of like the creativity aspects, but it does end up on an extremely high note when it comes to power, because this is indeed the culmination of everything Drajewel was as a deck, right? It has the even stronger version of the iconic power down skill. It still maintains the crit. It still maintains the need for all the different grades, and it even expands upon this by adding the grade 4 as a required grade. It still puts cards from drop zone into soul, which is, you know, a reincarnation of the put 2 into soul gimmick, which both the Drajewels had, more closely linked with the mask. And it also has the retires from the mask. That's another big one. Perhaps one of the only like new things about this one, arguably, is the 15 to the front row. But you could just argue that that's what Drajeweld Mask was also attempting to do with the free Persona rides there. If you take that into account, then yeah, sure. But it's just Persona Ride Plus now. So it's just like everything Drajeweld ever did rolled into one card, but also taken up to the next level. So it's a very insane deck. And if you just want the power fantasy of blowing out your opponent with a singular epic unit, then yeah, this may just be the deck for you. So even though, satisfaction aside for the dear old YouTuber man here, you guys make your own opinions and let me know what you feel about this card. I will still be playing it, and I still like it well enough. So I'd be really enjoyed to hear as well what you guys did with the deck that may be different, because I went with a very standardized, boring approach, but maybe there are ways to spice things up a little. If so, then I would love to see it, because I deadass want a little bit of flavor here and there, you know? So let's go ahead and leave it at that. If you guys did like this profile, then I got a few other deck profiles that I do. They're not very frequent on this channel, but the ones that I do, they tend to be pretty okay. So go ahead and check them out if you happen to see a deck that you like there. That aside, if you want other kinds of Vanguard content, then look no further. I've got tier lists, top 10s, discussions, the whole shebang. So go ahead and check all that out. And with that, take care. God bless.